Linda Harper never expected that the last check she would write from her savings account would leave her with exactly $1,200. She sat alone in her aging pickup outside the county courthouse, staring at the receipt without really seeing the numbers anymore. Over the previous 3 years, every dollar she and her late husband had carefully saved for retirement had slowly disappeared into hospital bills, medication, and treatments they both prayed would buy just a little more time. None of them complained. Thomas had fought with quiet determination until the very end. Linda would have spent every cent again if it meant hearing his voice one more morning. But when the medical debt finally caught up with the mortgage, the house followed. The foreclosure hearing lasted less than an hour. 37 years of marriage and memories had been reduced to signatures, legal language, and a set of keys left on an empty kitchen counter. Judge Robert Hayes met her outside before leaving for lunch. He had presided over hundreds of foreclosure cases, but today his voice carried unusual gentleness. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "I'm truly sorry." Linda smiled politely, though it required more strength than she expected. "You only followed the law." "Sometimes the law and fairness don't arrive together." She nodded without answering. There was nothing left to argue. Everything that could be sold had already been sold. Furniture, equipment, the family tractor, even Thomas's workshop tools had gone to pay another portion of the debt. What remained fit inside the back of her pickup: 2 suitcases, a few family photographs, several boxes of books, and 1 old coffee tin containing her grandfather Samuel Harper's letters. That evening, she checked into a modest roadside motel outside the county seat. The room contained a narrow bed, a worn armchair, and a window overlooking the highway. She spread her remaining financial papers across the small table. After paying the motel for 1 week and setting aside enough for fuel and groceries, exactly $1,200 remained untouched. It wasn't enough to begin a new life. It was barely enough to delay another crisis. The following morning, she stopped at a diner for breakfast before deciding what came next. While stirring sugar into her coffee, her eyes wandered across a county newspaper someone had left on the counter. Near the bottom of the classifieds appeared a notice surrounded by a thin black border. County land auction, surplus properties, Saturday. Among the listed parcels, one description immediately caught her attention. Harper Ridge Ranch, 120 acres, sold as is. Minimum bid $1,200. Linda stared at the name, Harper Ridge. She hadn't heard it spoken aloud since childhood. Her grandfather Samuel often talked about the ranch while repairing fences behind their old farmhouse. "People think that ranch survived because of cattle," he would say. "They're only seeing half the story." As a little girl, she had never asked what the other half was. She simply assumed older people liked telling unfinished stories. By Saturday morning, curiosity carried her to the county fairgrounds where the auction was being held. Contractors, ranchers, investors, and neighboring landowners gathered beneath a large pavilion, while photographs of abandoned properties rested on display boards. Linda stood quietly near the back, almost embarrassed to be there. She wasn't looking for opportunity anymore. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Several small parcels sold quickly. Old equipment changed hands within minutes. Then the auctioneer revealed a large aerial photograph of Harper Ridge Ranch. Weathered barns stood beside empty corrals. The ranch house leaned slightly beneath a faded metal roof. Windmills no longer turned. Dry grass covered fields that once supported thousands of cattle. "Next offering," the auctioneer announced, "Harper Ridge Ranch, 120 acres, Property abandoned for years. Structure sold as is. Opening bid, $1,200. Silence settled over the crowd. One rancher quietly shook his head. Water system's gone. Another muttered, costs more to restore than it's worth. The auctioneer scanned the audience. Do I have an opening bid? Before Linda fully understood why, she lifted her bidder card. 1,200. Heads turned toward her almost immediately. A few people exchanged puzzled smiles. The auctioneer waited several long seconds. No one raised another card. Going once? Linda's heart pounded. She could still lower her hand, admit she'd made a mistake, and walk away with enough money to survive another month. Yet she kept seeing her grandfather smiling beneath the broad Texas sky, talking about a ranch that meant far more than cattle. Going twice! Still no response. The gavel struck sharply against the podium. Sold! A polite ripple of applause followed as Linda completed the paperwork. When she signed the final document, every remaining dollar disappeared from her account. She officially owned 120 abandoned acres and almost nothing else. Late that afternoon, she drove through the broken front gate of Harper Ridge Ranch. The gravel road wound between weathered fences before opening onto the old headquarters. The ranch house stood silent. Empty corrals stretched toward distant hills. A large red barn leaned slightly with age beside rusted livestock pens. Everything looked forgotten, yet strangely peaceful. Linda stepped from her truck and listened. Only the wind answered. She wandered slowly through the headquarters building where dust coated old desks, broken chairs, and empty record shelves. Years earlier, ranch business had clearly filled these rooms. Now only silence remained. As she walked behind the barn, something caught her attention. Fresh tire tracks crossed the otherwise undisturbed dirt, curving around the rear of the building before disappearing into tall grass beyond the corrals. Someone had been searching the abandoned ranch very recently. Linda stood beside the fresh tire tracks for several minutes, studying the impressions in the dry soil instead of following them. Years of helping farmers through the County Agricultural Extension Office had taught her that tracks often revealed more than the people who left them intended. These weren't months old. The edges remained sharp despite the afternoon wind, and loose gravel still rested inside several tread marks. Someone had driven behind the barn recently, turned around near the old livestock pens, and left the ranch again. She resisted the temptation to search farther alone. The ranch covered 120 acres, much of it overgrown and unfamiliar. Curiosity could wait until she better understood the property before leaving. She locked the headquarters as best she could and drove into town to complete the final ownership paperwork. The county clerk handed her a stamped deed, a faded property survey, and a heavy ring of old brass keys attached to a leather tag stamped Harper Ridge. "Congratulations," he said politely. "Not many people thought that place would ever sell." Linda accepted the keys with a small smile. "Has anyone asked about the ranch lately?" "Mostly surveyors and developers checking property lines." He shrugged. "Nothing unusual." Outside, she unfolded the aging survey map across the hood of her truck. The ranch headquarters sat near the center of the property, surrounded by barns, corrals, wells, windmills, and several outbuildings. Everything appeared ordinary. Nothing on the map explained why someone had recently driven behind the abandoned barn. The following morning, she returned carrying work gloves, a broom, cleaning supplies, and a packed lunch. If the ranch truly belonged to her now, the least she could do was make one building usable. She had barely unlocked the headquarters door when another pickup rolled slowly into the yard. An elderly man stepped out wearing faded denim, worn boots, and a broad hat that looked nearly as old as the ranch itself. He paused beside the gate before offering a respectful nod. "You must be Linda Harper." "I am," she smiled warmly. "And you are?" "Jack Reynolds." He extended a weathered hand. "Worked this ranch 42 years before it shut down." Linda shook his hand firmly. "I wasn't expecting company." Jack looked toward the barns with quiet affection. "Neither was I. Heard somebody finally bought Harper Ridge. Had to see it with my own eyes." She invited him inside the headquarters. Jack moved slowly through the rooms, occasionally touching an old doorframe or glancing toward the dusty windows as though greeting familiar friends. "Busy place once," he said quietly. "You could hear cattle from sunrise until dark. Folks think this ranch was only about livestock." He smiled faintly. "They never really knew it." Linda remembered her grandfather saying something remarkably similar years before. They entered what had once been the ranch office. Empty shelves lined one wall where ledgers and account books had clearly been stored. A battered oak desk still faced the front window. Filing cabinets stood open, stripped of their contents long ago. "Most records disappeared when operations ended," Jack explained. "Sales books, grazing agreements, payroll ledgers. Everything went somewhere." "Everything?" Linda asked. Jack hesitated before answering. "Almost." He looked around the room thoughtfully before adding, "Some old hands believed Samuel Harper kept certain things close." Linda slowly turned toward him. "My grandfather." Jack nodded. "Good man. Didn't waste words." She smiled softly. "Neither did he waste notebooks." The remark reminded her of the coffee tin still resting behind the seat of her pickup. After retrieving it, she carefully opened the lid and removed several letters along with a small, weathered notebook she had nearly forgotten was tucked beneath them. Samuel Harper. His name remained faintly visible across the worn leather cover. Linda gently opened the notebook. Most pages contained brief observations about rainfall, grazing conditions, fence repairs, and livestock counts. Her grandfather's handwriting remained as neat as she remembered from childhood birthday cards. Near the final pages, the entries became shorter, more reflective. One sentence stood alone beneath a heavily underlined date. "The ranch was never saved by cattle." Linda read the line twice. No explanation followed. The remaining pages were blank. Jack quietly removed his hat as he looked at Samuel's handwriting. "I remember him writing that notebook during his last years here." Linda looked up. "Did he ever explain what he meant?" Jack slowly shook his head. "No." He walked toward the empty shelves where ranch ledgers had once stood. "But he spent more time in this office after everyone else went home." Linda glanced around the room. Dust covered nearly every surface. Yet despite the years of abandonment, the office still carried an unusual sense of order. She opened the desk drawers one by one. Most were empty except for rusted paper clips, broken pencils, and faded ranch forms. Nothing seemed remarkable. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that her grandfather's unfinished sentence pointed toward something more than memory. Jack rested one hand on the old desk before quietly saying, "Whatever Samuel believed truly saved this ranch. I don't think it ever left this place." Linda carried her grandfather's notebook with her everywhere over the next 2 days. Whenever she paused to rest from sweeping dust or clearing broken branches around the headquarters, she found herself opening the worn leather cover and rereading the same unfinished thought. The ranch was never saved by cattle. Samuel Harper had never been a man who wrote dramatic phrases. If he had recorded those words, he expected someone to understand them eventually. The question was how. Remembering her years working alongside county agricultural records, Linda decided that if answers no longer existed on the ranch itself, they might still survive in public archives. Early the next morning, she drove into Millhaven and stopped at the County Historical Records Office, a modest brick building attached to the local museum. Inside, shelves held property surveys, drought reports, agricultural maps, and generations of carefully organized county documents. A young woman arranging oversized survey books looked up with an easy smile. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," Linda replied. "I'm trying to learn more about Harper Ridge Ranch." Recognition crossed the woman's face. "You're the woman who bought it at the auction." Linda laughed softly. "Apparently, word travels quickly. Around here, it usually arrives before the mail." She extended her hand. "I'm Megan Foster. I manage the county historical records." Linda explained how she had purchased the ranch, met Jack Reynolds, and found Samuel Harper's notebook. She showed Megan the single handwritten sentence without offering any theories. Megan studied the page carefully before leading her toward a large table where several rolled land surveys rested inside protective tubes. "Let's start with the original ranch maps," she suggested. Together, they spread a century-old survey across the table. Every pasture, windmill, corral, water tank, barn, and headquarters building had been carefully measured and labeled. Megan then unrolled a second survey completed decades later after the ranch changed ownership. At first glance, the maps appeared nearly identical. Then Megan frowned. "That's strange." Linda leaned closer. "What is?" Megan traced one finger across the headquarters area. "The original survey shows an additional storage room attached beneath the office." Linda looked carefully. The early map clearly outlined a rectangular space beneath the ranch headquarters. On the later survey, it simply disappeared. "Was it demolished?" she asked. Megan searched accompanying engineering notes. Roof repairs were listed. Fence replacements appeared. Windmill maintenance had been recorded in remarkable detail. Nothing mentioned removing any structure beneath the headquarters. "The outside dimensions never changed," Megan observed quietly. "Yet this room vanishes from the later records." Linda unfolded the faded property survey she had received from the county after purchasing the ranch. The missing room wasn't shown there either. It was as though someone had quietly erased it from history without altering the building above. Before leaving, Megan photocopied both surveys. "Would you mind if I visited the ranch?" she asked. "I'd like to compare these measurements in person." "I'd appreciate the help." By afternoon, they arrived at Harper Ridge, carrying measuring tapes, notebooks, flashlights, and copies of the original surveys. Jack was repairing a loose gate hinge when they pulled into the yard. He smiled when he saw the rolled maps under Megan's arm. "Looks like you've come hunting history." "That's exactly what we're doing," Linda replied. Inside the headquarters office, Megan began measuring the room wall by wall while Linda recorded every dimension. The front and side walls matched both surveys perfectly. Only the rear wall created a problem. According to the earliest plans, the office should have extended several feet farther than it actually did. Megan lowered the measuring tape. "The building is too small on the inside." Jack slowly looked toward the back wall. "Never thought about it before." Linda rested her hand against the weathered paneling. It felt solid enough, yet somehow colder than the surrounding walls. They searched for signs of remodeling but found none. No patched flooring, no newer framing, no evidence that anyone had simply reduced the room. While walking slowly around the office, Linda noticed an enormous wooden storage cabinet standing against the rear wall. Dust covered its shelves, but something on the floor beneath caught her attention. Kneeling with a flashlight, she brushed aside loose dirt near one corner. Deep, parallel scrape marks crossed the floorboards beneath the cabinet, running several feet before disappearing underneath its base. She cleared more dust away. Additional scrape marks appeared beside the first set, each worn smooth by repeated movement over many years. They were too straight and too evenly spaced to be accidental. Megan crouched beside her. "This cabinet has been moved more than once." Jack stepped closer, studying the floor in silence. "Not just once," he murmured. "Many times." Linda slowly stood and looked from the old survey to the cabinet blocking the rear wall. Whatever Samuel Harper believed had truly saved the ranch. Every clue seemed to lead directly behind that heavy piece of furniture. Linda looked at the scrape marks one more time before placing both hands against the side of the massive storage cabinet. It barely moved. Years of dust had settled beneath its feet, and the weight of solid oak made it feel as though it belonged to the building itself. Jack stepped beside her without a word. "We'll need to move it together," he said. Megan cleared loose boxes and broken shelves from around the cabinet, while Linda checked that the old floorboards were still solid. "Ready?" Jack asked. They pushed slowly. At first, nothing happened. Then the cabinet shifted with a deep groan, sliding forward exactly along the worn scrape marks hidden beneath it. Dust rose into the afternoon light, filling the room with the smell of dry wood and old paper. They paused to catch their breath before pushing again. This time, the cabinet rolled nearly 3 feet away from the wall. When the dust finally settled, all three stared silently at what had been hidden behind it. Instead of ordinary wallboards, a square section of heavy plank flooring occupied the rear corner of the office. Iron hinges disappeared into the wood on one side. A thick metal ring lay recessed into the center, nearly invisible beneath layers of dirt. Megan knelt immediately, brushing away decades of dust with a soft hand brush from her equipment bag. "This isn't part of the floor," she whispered. Linda crouched beside her. The outline became clearer as more dirt disappeared. The square measured nearly 6 feet across. Its edges fitted so precisely that they blended almost perfectly with the surrounding floorboards. Jack slowly removed his hat. His voice sounded almost distant. "The old ranch hands used to tell stories about a room beneath the headquarters." He smiled sadly. "Nobody ever believed them." Linda slipped her fingers beneath the iron ring and pulled gently. The hatch didn't move. Whatever lay beneath had remained sealed for many years. She examined the metal more closely and noticed a tiny brass keyhole hidden beside the recessed handle. "There's a lock." Jack looked toward the heavy ring of brass keys hanging from Linda's belt. "The county gave you more keys than just the doors." She retrieved the ring and sorted through them carefully. Most had already opened exterior gates, barns, and storage sheds. One small brass key remained unused. Its teeth were finer than the others, almost decorative. Linda inserted it into the hidden lock. It slid smoothly into place. For a moment, she hesitated, thinking of her grandfather's notebook resting on the nearby desk. The ranch was never saved by cattle. She slowly turned the key. A dull metallic click echoed beneath the floor. Silence followed. Then the hatch lifted slightly along one edge, as though released after decades of waiting. Jack stepped forward and helped raise the heavy wooden door. Cool air drifted upward from the darkness below. A narrow wooden staircase disappeared beneath the headquarters into a space untouched by sunlight. Megan aimed her flashlight downward. Stone walls reflected the beam. The steps looked old but remarkably well preserved. There was no sign of collapse or flooding. Linda descended first, moving carefully one step at a time, while Jack steadied the hatch above. The air carried the faint scent of cedar and dry paper rather than damp earth. At the bottom of the staircase, she stopped, allowing her eyes to adjust. The flashlight revealed a room far larger than she expected. Wooden shelves lined every wall from floor to ceiling. A sturdy work table stood at the center beneath an old lantern. Metal filing cabinets occupied one corner beside rolled survey maps tied with faded cloth ribbons. Wooden crates bore neat, handwritten labels. Everything rested beneath a thin layer of dust. Yet almost nothing appeared damaged. It looked less like a forgotten cellar than a carefully protected archive waiting patiently for someone to return. Megan joined her, turning slowly as her light swept across the shelves. Leather-bound ledgers filled one section. Stacked journals occupied another. Framed photographs leaned neatly against labeled boxes. Maps, correspondence, and bound account books had all been arranged with remarkable care. Nothing suggested hidden money or valuable collectibles. Instead, every shelf seemed devoted to preserving records. Jack reached the bottom step last. He stood quietly in the center of the room, his eyes filling with emotion as he recognized the careful order surrounding him. "Samuel," he whispered softly, "you really did protect it." Linda walked toward the nearest shelf, running her fingers just above the dusty spines without touching them. Every instinct told her this was what her grandfather had wanted someone to find. Not wealth, but something far more important. She turned toward the others, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't a storage room." Megan nodded slowly as she looked across the endless rows of carefully preserved records. "It's the ranch's entire history." Linda stood quietly in the underground archive, allowing her eyes to adjust to the soft light from Megan's flashlight. Every shelf, every cabinet, and every wooden crate had been arranged with remarkable precision. Nothing appeared hurried or forgotten. Whoever closed the vault had expected these records to remain untouched until the right person found them. Jack slowly removed his gloves before touching anything. "We do this carefully," he said. "Places like this only stay original once." Megan nodded. She unpacked archival gloves, a camera, acid-free document sleeves, and a notebook. "We'll photograph everything before moving a single item." Linda smiled faintly. "My grandfather would approve." They began at the large work table standing in the center of the room. An old kerosene lantern rested beside neatly stacked ranch ledgers tied with faded blue ribbon. A brass ruler, dried ink bottle, and well-used fountain pen remained exactly where someone had left them decades earlier. Nothing suggested hidden riches. Instead, everything reflected years of careful record-keeping. Megan photographed the table from every angle before Linda gently untied the ribbon around the first bundle of journals. Each leather cover carried only a year embossed in fading gold letters. Beside them rested grazing ledgers, water agreements, livestock inventories, handwritten correspondence, family photographs, and carefully rolled survey maps. Jack slowly looked around the room in disbelief. "I thought every ranch record disappeared when operations ended." Linda carefully opened the first journal. The handwriting belonged to Samuel Harper. Most entries recorded ordinary ranch business: rainfall totals, fence repairs, calving seasons, hay production, windmill maintenance. Yet scattered throughout the pages were short notes about neighboring families. Delivered feed before sunrise. Waterline repaired quietly. Grazing extended another month. The writing never explained why. It simply recorded what had been done. Alongside many family names appeared tiny handwritten symbols no larger than a pencil mark: a water droplet, a small oak tree, a horseshoe, a bundle of wheat, a simple open gate. Linda frowned. These aren't accounting marks. Megan leaned closer. They're repeated too consistently. Linda turned several more pages. The same symbols appeared beside only certain family names. Most entries remained ordinary ranch records, but whenever one of the symbols appeared, brief notes often followed. Fence completed, herd returned safely, supplies delivered, water restored. None mentioned payment. Jack picked up another ledger from the same shelf. I never remember seeing symbols like these. Nearby wooden boxes contained hundreds of carefully folded letters tied together with cloth ribbons. Many were addressed directly to Samuel Harper or earlier ranch managers. Linda opened one at random. A neighboring rancher thanked Samuel for helping during an especially difficult summer, but never explained exactly what had happened. Another letter expressed gratitude for opening the gate when no one else could. A third simply read, "You saved more than cattle." Linda quietly returned each letter to its place. They felt deeply personal. Yet none asked for recognition or repayment. Along the opposite wall stood shelves filled with family photographs. Most showed ranch workers standing beside livestock, repairing fences, or gathering for harvest meals. Others captured neighboring families smiling in front of modest farmhouses. Some photographs carried handwritten names on the back. Others displayed only the same mysterious symbols appearing throughout the journals. Jack lifted one carefully. It showed several children standing beside a windmill with Samuel Harper smiling quietly in the background. I remember one of these boys, Jack whispered. His family's herd nearly disappeared during the drought. Linda noticed a small water droplet drawn beside the family name. The same symbol appeared repeatedly throughout several journals covering the same years. She carefully replaced the photograph exactly where she found it. Nothing inside the archive suggested buried treasure or hidden ownership claims. Everything pointed toward ordinary ranch families whose stories someone believed deserved preserving. Near the back wall, Linda discovered several oversized grazing ledgers arranged by year. Their pages listed pasture rotations, livestock counts, acreage assignments, and water usage in meticulous detail. Yet scattered throughout the records, the same symbols quietly appeared beside selected family names. Every mark had been written by the same careful hand. Megan compared several years of entries. The symbols follow families, she observed, not specific fields or livestock. Linda slowly nodded. She opened another ledger from a different decade. Again, the same pattern appeared. Different years, different droughts, different ranch managers. The symbols remained remarkably consistent. She rested one finger lightly beneath a family name marked with the open gate symbol. These people were being tracked for something, she said softly. Jack looked thoughtfully across the room before answering. Not tracked. He gently closed the ledger. Protected. His quiet response lingered in the silence of the underground archive as Linda looked once more at the mysterious symbols that had followed certain families across decades of carefully preserved ranch history. The underground archive became Linda's focus from sunrise until late afternoon over the following week. She and Megan agreed that nothing would leave the vault until every shelf, ledger, photograph, and map had been photographed exactly where Samuel Harper had placed it. Jack unlocked the headquarters each morning before they arrived and quietly repaired loose fence rails or cleared brush around the buildings while they worked below. The ranch no longer felt forgotten. It felt as though it had simply been waiting. Megan spread copies of the grazing ledgers across a large table upstairs, rather than risk damaging the originals. Beside them, she arranged county drought reports, agricultural census records, tax assessments, irrigation permits, and decades of archived newspapers. "If these symbols mean something," she said, "they'll eventually match the public record." Linda began with the water droplet symbol. It appeared beside dozens of neighboring families during the worst drought years. Megan compared the dates with county water reports. Almost immediately, a pattern emerged. Every family marked with the droplet had nearly exhausted its legal water allocation before unexpectedly surviving another season. Yet no official emergency assistance had ever been recorded. Linda turned another page. Beside nearly every marked name, Samuel had written short notes. Water line repaired, pump restored, access continued. The entries were matter-of-fact, never explaining who provided the help. Next, they examined the bundle of wheat symbol. Agricultural reports revealed repeated crop failures during those same years. Families carrying the wheat mark somehow planted again the following season, despite having reported almost no seed reserves. Samuel's journals quietly filled the missing pieces. Seed delivered before planting. Return only if able. No publicity. Megan looked up thoughtfully. These weren't business transactions. Linda slowly nodded. They were lifelines. The oak tree symbol revealed another pattern. Tax records showed several struggling ranches avoiding foreclosure despite prolonged losses. Samuel's journals mentioned temporary grazing agreements, shared pasture, and repaired fencing. Nothing described payment beyond simple phrases like, "settled when harvest returned," or "good neighbors keep one another standing." The horseshoe symbol led them toward livestock records. Families whose herds had nearly disappeared during disease outbreaks or drought suddenly recovered within a year. Ranch inventories inside the archive quietly recorded temporary cattle loans without formal contracts. Calves returned after recovery. Breeding stock shared. Herd restored. Samuel documented every exchange carefully, yet never treated generosity as charity. Linda rested both hands on the table. He wasn't protecting the ranch's profits. He was protecting everyone around it, Megan replied. They spent another afternoon tracing every marked family through public records. Different generations appeared, different hardships, yet the symbols always represented people facing circumstances beyond their control. Water, seed, livestock, grazing land, quiet assistance given without public recognition. Jack listened carefully as they explained each discovery later that evening. He smiled with quiet understanding. "Nobody wanted folks to feel ashamed," he said. "Around here, people worked hard. Sometimes drought simply worked harder." Linda looked toward the underground archive. Every ledger she opened made her grandfather's sentence clearer. The ranch had survived because its neighbors survived with it. Late the next afternoon, another pickup entered the ranch yard. A professionally dressed man stepped out carrying a leather portfolio. He introduced himself with an easy handshake. "Ethan Walker. I work with a regional land development group." Linda recognized the name from county notices. "You're connected with the proposed solar project." "That's right." Ethan looked across the weathered barns and open pasture. "It's beautiful land, even after all these years." He spoke respectfully, without pressure. "I understand restoring a ranch this size isn't inexpensive. If you ever decide the project is more than you want to manage, we'd be interested in purchasing the property." Linda appreciated his honesty. "Thank you. I'll remember that." Ethan handed her his card before adding, "Whatever you decide, I hope the place finds a future." After he left, Jack watched the truck disappear beyond the front gate. "Good fellow," he said quietly. "Just looking at the land differently than we are." Linda slipped the business card inside her notebook without another word. That evening, she returned to one of Samuel's journals covering the harshest drought years. Near the middle of the volume, she noticed a phrase appearing again and again beside different family names. Gate opened before sunrise. Another delivery through the open gate. Family entered by the open gate. Unlike the symbols, the phrase had been written plainly, almost as though anyone reading the journal at the time would understand its meaning. Linda searched another volume. The same words appeared repeatedly across different years. She looked toward Jack. Was there ever a place on this ranch called the Open Gate? Jack's expression changed instantly. He stared at the journal for several long moments before answering in a voice barely above a whisper. I haven't heard those words spoken since Samuel was alive. Arthur remained silent for so long that Linda wondered if he regretted saying anything at all. He rested both hands on the back of an old wooden chair, his eyes fixed on Samuel Harper's journal. Finally, he spoke in a voice softened by memory. The Open Gate wasn't a place you could find on a ranch map, he said. It was a promise. Megan looked up from her notes. A promise? Jack nodded slowly. Whenever drought hit hard enough that a neighboring family couldn't feed their cattle or keep water flowing, Samuel would say, "Leave the gate open." It meant nobody in real need would be turned away. Linda glanced back at the journal. The simple phrase suddenly carried far greater meaning than she had imagined. So families came here? Sometimes before daylight, Jack replied. Sometimes after dark. They didn't want anyone seeing them ask for help. He smiled sadly. Samuel understood that pride could be as heavy as hunger. Over the next several days, Linda and Megan continued working through the underground archive. Every journal confirmed what Jack had described. During the worst drought years, Harper Ridge quietly became the center of an informal network of neighboring ranchers helping one another survive. Some shared pasture for a season. Others loaned breeding cattle until herds recovered. Seed grain was delivered before planting without contracts or public announcements. Water lines were extended across property boundaries whenever wells failed. Every act appeared inside the journals with calm, practical language. No one described themselves as generous. No one expected recognition. Samuel simply recorded what had been done, so the agreements would never be forgotten. Linda opened another leather-bound volume from a particularly difficult summer. The pages contained lists of families marked with the familiar symbols. Beneath each entry, Samuel had written brief notes. 20 calves returned after spring. Water restored before harvest. Fence rebuilt together. No payment requested. Megan compared the journal with county tax records. Nearly every family Samuel mentioned remained on their land through years that forced many other ranches into foreclosure. These records explain something historians never could, she said quietly. People always wondered how so many small ranches survived those droughts. Linda gently closed the journal. They survived together. On another shelf, they discovered bundles of personal letters tied neatly with faded twine. Unlike business correspondence, these letters came directly from neighboring families. One rancher thanked Samuel for quietly grazing his cattle until rain returned. A widow wrote that anonymous sacks of feed had appeared beside her barn before sunrise every week through the hardest winter. Another letter simply read, "We never forgot that you left the gate open." None mentioned repayment beyond doing the same for someone else whenever possible. Linda carefully returned every letter to its original place. They were expressions of gratitude, not records of debt. Late that afternoon, she uncovered another notebook written in Samuel's familiar hand. Unlike the journals, it contained short reminders rather than daily entries. Keep every ledger together. Never separate the letters. Protect the families, not the favors. One sentence stood alone near the end of the notebook. Kindness loses its meaning when it becomes someone's pride. Linda smiled softly. The words sounded exactly like the grandfather who taught her that neighbors mattered more than fences. Jack looked over her shoulder and quietly nodded. That's Samuel. As evening sunlight filtered through the small ventilation openings above the underground archive, Megan examined the final cabinet that had not yet been opened. Most drawers contained unused stationery, blank record books, and carefully folded survey copies. In the lowest drawer, tucked behind several ranch maps, rested a single large envelope sealed with dark red wax. Dust covered its surface, but the seal remained completely intact. Across the front, written in Samuel Harper's unmistakable handwriting, appeared a simple message: to whoever keeps the gate open. Silence settled across the room. Jack slowly removed his hat and held it against his chest. Megan lowered her camera without taking another photograph. Linda reached carefully for the sealed envelope, feeling its surprising weight in her hands. Whatever answers still remained inside the underground archive, her grandfather had chosen to place them inside this final letter, trusting that one day someone would open it, not simply because they had discovered it, but because they understood why the gate had always been left open. Linda held the sealed envelope for a long moment before carefully breaking the dark red wax. The paper inside had yellowed with age, but Samuel Harper's handwriting remained steady and unmistakable. Megan photographed the envelope before unfolding the letter, while Jack quietly stood beside the work table with his hat resting against his chest. Linda took a slow breath and began reading aloud. If you are reading this, then you have taken the time to look beyond the fences, the empty barns, and the abandoned fields. That tells me the ranch still has someone willing to listen. She paused, feeling her grandfather's familiar voice in every carefully written sentence. Many people will believe this vault was hidden to protect land, money, or ownership. They are mistaken. It was hidden to protect memory. Linda continued reading as the room grew even quieter. The journals, ledgers, maps, letters, photographs, and agreements must never be separated. Alone, each one tells a pleasant story. Together, they prove that Harper Ridge survived because neighbors chose one another before they chose profit. Megan lowered her eyes for a moment, quietly absorbing the words. Samuel explained that the symbols beside family names had never been secret business codes. They existed to protect dignity. Families who accepted water, grazing land, livestock, seed grain, or food should never become objects of gossip or gratitude. They deserved to continue living as respected neighbors, not as people forever remembered for needing help. If these records are ever discovered, Linda read, let them preserve compassion without exposing hardship. A person's difficult season should never become their permanent identity. Jack slowly nodded. That's exactly how he lived, he whispered. The final pages explained why the underground archive had been sealed beneath the headquarters. Samuel feared that after the ranch eventually closed, the ledgers would be auctioned separately. Photographs scattered among collectors, maps stored in different offices, and letters discarded as unimportant. Once divided, no one would ever understand the full story. Only together could the records prove that an ordinary ranch quietly helped keep an entire farming community alive through years when survival often depended upon neighbors trusting one another. Linda carefully folded the letter and placed it beside Samuel's weathered notebook. Suddenly, his unfinished sentence finally made complete sense. The ranch had never been saved by cattle because cattle had never been its greatest strength. People had. The following morning, Linda and Megan began creating detailed photographic records of every shelf inside the underground archive before moving nothing from its original place. Each journal was photographed beside the ledgers it referenced. Every map remained connected to the agreements stored beside it. Letters stayed grouped with the families whose stories they quietly completed. The arrangement itself formed part of the history Samuel wanted preserved. Late that afternoon, Megan's phone rang. After listening for several moments, she looked toward Linda with visible concern. That was the county planning office. Linda immediately recognized the expression on her face. What's happened? The redevelopment proposal moved another step forward this morning. Jack quietly looked up from the work table. Megan continued carefully. The ranch doesn't have historical protection yet. Unless emergency preservation is approved soon, redevelopment planning can begin within days. The words settled heavily inside the underground archive. Linda slowly looked around the room. Decades of carefully preserved journals, letters, photographs, grazing agreements, water records, and family histories had survived because Samuel believed someone would eventually understand why they belonged together. Now, after waiting all those years, everything risked being lost before the story could reach anyone beyond these walls. Jack rested one weathered hand upon the old work table. We don't have much time. Linda gently returned Samuel's letter to its protective envelope before placing it beside his notebook. Then she looked toward Megan. The archive is documented. She turned toward Jack. The evidence is ready. Finally, she looked around the quiet underground room where generations of compassion had been preserved in silence. Now we have to save the ranch before history disappears a second time. Linda arrived at the ranch before sunrise, carrying carefully organized copies of every journal, grazing ledger, photograph, letter, survey map, and agreement preserved inside the underground archive. The originals remained exactly where Samuel Harper had left them, protected beneath the headquarters until professional conservators could examine them. She remembered one sentence from his final letter more clearly than any other. The records only mattered if they stayed together. Megan met her at the headquarters with archival storage boxes, digital scanners, and a detailed cataloging checklist prepared for the County Historical Commission. We'll record every shelf exactly as Samuel arranged it, she said. Nothing gets separated. Linda smiled quietly. That's the promise we made. They spent the morning photographing each section of the archive in sequence. Grazing ledgers remained beside the drought journals, they explained. Water agreements stayed with the maps showing neighboring wells. Family letters remained grouped with the photographs and ledger entries that completed their stories. Every document strengthened another. Alone, they described ordinary ranch business. Together, they revealed an entire community quietly choosing cooperation over survival alone. Jack searched through the remaining ranch buildings while they worked below. Late that afternoon, he returned carrying an old wooden ranch gate sign that had fallen behind broken fence posts years earlier. The faded lettering simply read, North Pasture. He rested it gently against the archive wall before smiling. Funny thing, he said. People always remembered the pasture. He looked toward Samuel's journals. Nobody remembered why the gate stayed open. Linda placed the weathered sign beside several photographs showing neighboring families gathered near the same entrance decades earlier. The next morning, Megan received confirmation from state preservation historians. After reviewing the digital archive, they believed the collection represented one of the most complete surviving records of cooperative ranching practices ever documented in the region. An emergency inspection team agreed to visit immediately. They're especially interested because every journal, agreement, and photograph remained together. Megan explained, Most collections like this are scattered over generations. Linda glanced toward the underground archive. My grandfather made sure that never happened. The inspectors arrived shortly after sunrise. Historians, archivists, and agricultural preservation specialists carefully entered the underground vault after documenting every room inside the headquarters. They compared Samuel Harper's handwriting with county correspondence preserved elsewhere. It matched perfectly. Grazing agreements aligned with county land surveys. Water-sharing records corresponded with drought reports and irrigation permits. Family letters matched names recorded inside census records and tax assessments Megan had already assembled. Every document confirmed another. No one questioned the authenticity of the archive. They spoke instead about how extraordinarily complete it remained. News of the discovery spread quickly across the county. The local newspaper published a front-page story describing the hidden ranch archive and Samuel Harper's journals documenting years of quiet cooperation during devastating droughts. Within days, neighboring families began arriving at Harper Ridge, carrying faded photographs, handwritten notes, livestock receipts, seed invoices, and family letters discovered inside trunks and desk drawers. One elderly rancher recognized his father's name beside the water droplet symbol. His family had always believed an anonymous neighbor repaired their failed well during the drought, but no one knew who organized it. Another woman carried a photograph showing her grandparents standing beside Samuel Harper after receiving temporary grazing rights that kept their small herd alive. The open gate symbol appeared beside their family name exactly as it did throughout the journals. Megan carefully copied every document before returning the originals. Each new story fit naturally into the growing historical record Samuel had preserved. Jack quietly answered questions from historians and visiting families throughout the week. At first, he spoke only about ranch work, branding seasons, water pumps, and long days repairing fences beneath the summer sun. Gradually, his stories became more personal. Nobody announced they were helping, he explained. One ranch sent hay. Another shared breeding stock. Somebody repaired a neighbor's windmill before sunrise. Folks simply acted like neighbors because that's what needed doing. He smiled gently. Samuel always said the gate worked best when nobody argued about who deserved to walk through it. Ethan Walker returned after reading the newspaper reports. He spent nearly an hour walking across the ranch before asking Linda if he could see the underground archive. After quietly studying the journals and photographs, he closed the final ledger with great care. I thought I was looking at underused land, he admitted. Instead, I found proof that this ranch carried an entire community. Linda nodded softly. That's why it has to remain whole. Ethan extended his hand. I understand completely. As the inspection period concluded, the County Heritage Commission announced a public hearing to determine whether Harper Ridge Ranch would receive permanent protection. Historians submitted formal reports. Agricultural experts verified the records. Families filled the meeting hall carrying copies of photographs, letters, and grazing agreements connected to Samuel's journals. Linda sat beside Megan and Jack with her grandfather's weathered notebook resting quietly in her lap. She remembered arriving at the county auction believing her last $1,200 would probably disappear into another mistake. Instead, it had led her back to the place where Samuel's unfinished sentence finally made sense. The commission chair gathered the final recommendations, thanked everyone who had shared their family's history, then looked across the crowded room before quietly saying, "The County Heritage Commission will now proceed to its final vote." The meeting hall became perfectly still as the members of the County Heritage Commission finished marking their ballots. Linda sat between Jack and Megan. Her grandfather, Samuel Harper's weathered notebook, resting quietly in her hands. 8 months earlier, she had walked into the county auction believing she had nothing left except $1,200 and memories that could no longer pay the bills. She had lost her husband, her home, and nearly every plan she had made for retirement. Buying an abandoned ranch had seemed less like an investment than a final attempt to believe her life still held another chapter. The commission chair reviewed the ballots one final time before looking toward the audience. A gentle smile crossed his face. "The motion passes unanimously," he announced. "Effective immediately, Harper Ridge Ranch and its underground historical archive are granted permanent county heritage protection." For a brief moment, no one moved. Then quiet applause spread across the room until nearly everyone rose to their feet. Jack slowly removed his hat, holding it against his chest while tears filled his eyes. Megan reached over and squeezed Linda's hand. Linda simply closed her eyes, letting herself breathe. The ranch would remain exactly where it had always belonged. Within days, all redevelopment planning officially ended. Preservation specialists arrived to stabilize the headquarters, reinforce the aging barns, repair damaged fencing, and restore the underground archive without changing its original appearance. Every decision focused on preserving rather than replacing. The weathered headquarters remained standing with its worn wooden porch. The old corrals stayed exactly where generations of ranch hands had worked cattle beneath the summer sun. Even the faded North Pasture Gate sign was restored instead of replaced. Standing once again beside the entrance where Samuel's journals had so often mentioned the open gate. The underground archive received the greatest care. Conservators documented every shelf before carefully preserving each journal. Grazing ledger, water agreement, photograph, letter, and survey map. After restoration, every document returned to precisely the place where Samuel Harper had arranged it decades earlier. The hidden vault remained beneath the headquarters, but guided tours now allowed visitors to descend the same staircase Linda first discovered beneath the concealed trapdoor. Historians spent months studying the remarkable collection. Together, the journals revealed a story far different from the ranch's official history. During years of relentless drought, neighboring ranches survived not because Harper Ridge possessed better land or larger herds, but because ordinary ranch families quietly refused to let one another fail. Grazing land was shared before cattle starved. Seed grain appeared before planting season. Wells were repaired without invoices. Water crossed property lines whenever pumps failed. Breeding stock was loaned with nothing more than a handshake. Samuel's careful records proved what many descendants had only heard as family stories. The ranch's greatest harvest had never been measured in cattle. It had always been measured in neighbors helping neighbors. As newspapers across the state shared the discovery, families traveled to Harper Ridge carrying weathered photographs, handwritten notes, faded livestock receipts, and personal letters that had rested untouched inside trunks for generations. One elderly woman recognized her grandparents beside the oak tree symbol inside Samuel's ledgers. Another family found a grazing agreement matching a story passed down through 4 generations about the summer their herd survived because someone left a gate open. Piece by piece, forgotten acts of generosity returned to the families whose lives they had quietly changed. Jack became one of the ranch's most beloved volunteers. Visitors often gathered around him beneath the old windmill as he described branding seasons, drought years, long days repairing fences, and evenings when neighboring ranchers quietly arrived after sunset. He never described Samuel Harper as extraordinary. Instead, he reminded everyone that dozens of ordinary families chose compassion together. One ranch couldn't save a county, he liked to say, but a county full of neighbors could. Megan expanded the historical archive until it became one of the most respected collections of agricultural history in the region. Researchers visited not because Harper Ridge had been the richest ranch, but because its records documented something almost never preserved with such completeness: the quiet cooperation that allowed rural communities to survive impossible years. Ethan Walker returned several months after restoration began. Standing beside the restored headquarters, he looked across the wide pastures before turning toward Linda. "I came here hoping to build something new," he admitted. "Instead, I found something that already mattered." Linda smiled warmly. "Sometimes preserving is the better kind of progress." Ethan nodded without hesitation. "I couldn't agree more." Linda accepted the position of managing the ranch museum and historical archive. Every morning she unlocked the headquarters before visitors arrived, just as ranch managers once began their work before sunrise. She often paused inside the underground archive, looking across the carefully preserved journals before beginning another day. She never rearranged a single shelf. Samuel had organized the story perfectly. Her responsibility was simply to make sure it remained whole. Exactly 8 months after spending her last $1,200, Harper Ridge Ranch officially reopened to the public. Hundreds of visitors attended the dedication ceremony. At the entrance to the underground archive stood a simple wooden plaque bearing words taken directly from Samuel Harper's final letter. Together, these records tell the truth. Families paused there before entering. Many expected to see old ranch equipment and livestock records. Most left carrying something far more valuable. One afternoon, a young boy studying the grazing ledgers looked up at Linda and asked, "Why didn't your grandfather tell everyone what he was doing?" Linda smiled gently before answering, "Because he wanted people to remember that help was given," she said softly, "not who deserved the credit." The boy thought quietly for a moment before nodding and continuing through the archive. After the last visitors left one peaceful evening, Linda stood alone beside the restored north pasture gate. Wind moved gently through the tall grass, exactly as it had the first afternoon she arrived. With nothing except hope, she barely believed herself. She remembered leaving the courthouse convinced her life had ended alongside everything she had lost. Looking back now, she realized it had only changed direction. Spending her last $1,200 on an abandoned ranch had seemed impossible to explain. Yet that single decision led her to preserve proof that the richest communities are never built by wealth alone. They are built by ordinary people who quietly refuse to let their neighbors stand alone. Harper Ridge had never been saved by cattle. It had been saved by open gates, shared burdens, trusted hands, and hearts generous enough to expect nothing in return. And as each new visitor descended into the underground archive to read Samuel Harper's journals, the ranch everyone once believed was worthless continued producing its greatest harvest, reminding one generation after another that kindness, when carefully preserved, never stops growing. 8 months after buying Harper Ridge Ranch, Linda often found herself standing beside the old north pasture gate just before sunset. The fields were still quiet. The wind still carried the scent of dry grass, and the weathered fences still looked much the same as they had on the day she first arrived, with nothing but $1,200 and a heart full of uncertainty. The only real difference was that the ranch was no longer forgotten. Every week, visitors came from across the state to walk through the restored headquarters, descend into the underground archive, and discover the journals Samuel Harper had protected for so many years. Some arrived expecting to learn about ranching history. Most left talking about something entirely different. They talked about neighbors who quietly shared water when wells ran dry, families who loaned cattle without asking for guarantees, ranch hands who repaired fences before sunrise so another family could stay on their land one more season. They discovered that the greatest stories hidden beneath Harper Ridge had never been about ownership. They had always been about generosity. One afternoon, an elderly rancher lingered beside the display containing Samuel's journals. Before leaving, he turned to Linda and said, "My father always told me that someone opened a gate for our family during the drought, but he never knew who." Linda smiled gently and rested one hand on the weathered ledger beside her. "Maybe," she replied softly. "Your father wasn't supposed to know." The man nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude rather than sadness. That somehow makes it even more meaningful. After the visitors left each evening, Linda often walked through the underground archive alone. She never changed the arrangement of the journals. She never moved the photographs or the letters. Samuel had already placed every piece exactly where it belonged. She simply stood quietly in the silence, grateful that the story had remained whole long enough for someone to understand it. Losing her husband had broken her heart. Losing her home had made her believe the best years of her life were behind her. Yet if none of those painful chapters had happened, she never would have driven through the broken gate of an abandoned ranch that everyone else ignored. She never would have uncovered the hidden archive beneath the headquarters, and hundreds of ordinary acts of kindness might have remained buried beneath dust for another generation. Harper Ridge had cost her every dollar she had left. In return, it gave her something far greater than security. It gave her purpose. If this story leaves us with one lesson, perhaps it is this: the greatest wealth we will ever possess is not measured by the land we own, the money we save, or the success others can see. It is measured by the lives we quietly help when no one is keeping score. Long after buildings grow old, fences fall, and names begin to fade, kindness has a remarkable way of finding its way home. And sometimes, all it takes to change an entire community is one person willing to leave the gate open.